Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the 808 Podcast. It's the podcast where we take business owners, CEOs, marketing people, whoever else I feel like, 4 questions, 8 minutes and 8 seconds, because 808 looks like Bob. Here we go. Question number 1, a few sentences. Tell me who you are and what do you do?
Hi, Bob. Richard Barnett. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at SupplyFrame. I live in Austin, Texas, and I've spent probably about 25 years in the enterprise software space. It's a really exciting time to be a CMO these days in this market.
It is. Question number 2, Richard, what advice do you want to share? Go.
Well, one of the things that we've worked on recently at SupplyFrame is really a lot of focus strategically around really getting the buyer persona right, which means, who is our target audience? Who are those sort of individuals that are involved in the purchase, not just the use of these software solutions, and trying to, go a little bit deeper and leverage some new forms of insights to, generally target what our go-to-market, make content that we're developing, consistent and meaningful and drive engagement, and then more importantly, facilitate their decision to make an investment in the solution.
Okay, so how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so, traditionally, there's a wide range. If you kind of talk about buyer personas or user personas, sometimes you'll have flavors of that for product marketing, product management. Sometimes it lives just in marketing. Sometimes it's actually, widely adopted in the sales organization. The approach that we took is to really have a comprehensive buyer persona and think about it from multiple dimensions. So the first dimension is to understand, what is the general role definition, profile, some psychodemographic, right? So what would be the typical education, areas of specialization that these executives may have. You would also look at what information resources they're typically, leveraging, working with, or, might influence them. And then a newer area that's really kind of fun to look at is the little bit more of the detail of their psychological profile. So increasingly, we're able to actually look at and understand profiles maybe based on a LinkedIn profile using something like Crystal Reports that, actually builds a DSC. They have kind of a personality model, that they use. And there's kind of a, like many of these personality models, there's a range of variations of personality traits and behaviors. And then that helps you kind of map into, okay, how do you need to communicate them? What energizes them? What voice or tone do they appreciate? What turns them off, and shuts them down? If you're negotiating with them, what is a way to kind of maybe break through a difficult issue that's contentious? And that is really, I think, one of the most fun new aspects of building buyer personas and then rolling that out with your team and your sales organization. And then the other area that I think is really important for people to pay closer attention to are 2 things. One is, what are the business problems and challenges that they're trying to solve? And not in a generic way, like try to be as specific to, the kinds of, key strategic initiatives that they may be facing, maybe not just based on their executive role, but also maybe the industry that they're in. Right. And then the second point is, what is their role in a decision-making process? Because one of the things that we see, say above investments, say over $300,000 to $400,000, so larger B2B SaaS solutions, which is kind of the area we focus in on, is that you increasingly have 5.8 to 7.4, based on research, individuals, organizations, or entities that are actually involved in a decision-making process. And what most traditional sales teams have not really understood is that they may have one sponsoring executive or one mobilizer or coach in the deal, and they think they're done. But actually what goes on beyond when a proposal is presented is a number of executives that they may not have even had engagement with that have a huge role in that decision-making process. So things like alternate use of capital, other strategic initiatives. So it's increasingly what's happening is that company leaders are making decisions to invest not just based on the merits of that solution and that potential business value, but it's across the portfolio of everything else they're trying to deal with. And given COVID and the pandemic and all this disruption, to rise above the noise, to be one of the 3 or 4 things they invest in versus the 30 other ideas that are sort of on the table, requires a very high level of engagement, of relevance, of tailoring your message, your value proposition, et cetera, to those folks. One of the funny things about the psychodemographics aspects is that, generally sales folks in general are relators, right?
Right.
They're relationship oriented in their orientation. Some are like sort of ops and analytically oriented as well. But our company at SupplyFrame, we're often engaging with engineering leaders, supply chain and procurement leaders. And
Actually, Richard, I got to interrupt you because we only have 3 minutes left. If people want to know more, they're going to have to look you up. We got to keep going here because question number 3, it is time for shout outs. Richard, who are you shouting out today?
Well, I think, related to this buyer persona work, the Buyer Persona Institute, I think, is a really great resource for folks that are looking for best practices to understand sort of, leading research in this area. Adele Ravella wrote Buyer Personas, which I think is a really great resource to use, just again, as a reference. And there's a great community of other folks around the Buyer Persona Institute that I think you can draw insight from.
Perfect. And question number 4, final fun question. Richard, tell me about your first sale.
So I've been involved in sales at different points in my life, but when I was thinking about this question, truly my first sales job was when I was a Little League baseball player, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I played catcher on my Little League team in Houston. And back then, I think they still do it. They would do fundraising for your team or for the league, and we sold $1 candy bars. And the thing about that was, you have to learn how to knock on doors. And this is back when we sort of would allow kids to go do that. I would spend hours going through apartment complexes, knocking on doors. And then you get really quick and good about how to sell that candy bar and adapt your message to whoever was opening that door. So if it was another kid, if it was a mom, or if it was a dad. And it was amazing how much you learned about core selling skills as a 10-year-old selling candy bars. But one year I won the prize for the most candy bars sold, because we had some folks that came into our home and burglarized us. They took the TV, my mom's jewelry, and they took the inventory of 1,000 candy bars that I had on the counter, which I thought was the funniest thing, that those are the 3 things they took out of the house was all my candy bars. So we chalked it up to insurance money, and I won the award for the top producer for that.
Oh, there you go. So I love that story. That's very unique there. So, hey, Richard, you've got 1 minute and 2 seconds left. Promo time. Ask me a question, talk about the weather, or we can end early. Go for it.
Well, I'm curious, Bob, as you've gone through this podcast, what you see the evolution of, the best ways to engage with the audience, what you're seeing are the patterns out there, because so many folks have different expectations of what they want to get out of a podcast or, and how they access that information. What are you seeing? I'm
seeing this as being an amazing networking tool. Because so many times I get messages, I want to get to know you. Would you like to get another call? In other words, you want to sell me. And I'm actually telling people, be authentic. If you want to sell me, just tell me. I'm fine with that. I am not against the cold pitch. I'd be kind of hypocritical if I was. But this whole, I want to get to know about your business. I understand you do this.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple. Tell me, hey, you might have this suck. I have a solution. Does that relate to you?
Right.
The end. And then I'm either going to say, tell me more, or no, don't have that suck, and here's why.
Sure. Makes sense. No, it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I see the same. It's all
actually speaking of that, that is the timer. You pulled it off. 4 questions at 8 minutes and 8 seconds. Richard, why is it 8 minutes and 8 seconds?
Well, it looks like Bob.
It does. It does. Your website, say it real quick.
SupplyFrame.com.
It's in the description. It's magic. Richard, thank you so much for being on. Tip of the hat to you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Take care.
You're welcome. And for everyone else watching or listening, I am legally required to tell you to like, share, comment, subscribe, thumbs up, ring the bell, whatever the heck the social media network tells you all to do. You all have a good one now. Talk to you later. Bye.